Call to order the special city commission meeting of Wednesday, June 30th, or excuse me, 20th, 2018. Let the roll show that all city commissioners are present. Special meeting, so we have a set order of business. We look for a motion to approve the order of business.
So moved, Mr. President.
I have a motion to approve with a second. Any discussion on the order of business? Not. All in favor of the order of business?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Same sign. The order of business is approved. We'll move into our special meeting agenda, and then that will be presented by city staff and KLJ. We have planning principles. So, Mr. Hadley, are you starting this discussion?
Mr. President, yes, I just started off with, this is meant to have us look at our current comprehensive plan that was done a number of years ago, see what we've achieved, see if the direction is still where we want to go, and then KLJ is here to also provide us some insight on utilizing our current comprehensive plan and maybe our existing land use ordinance with changes as well that would allow us to better suit our community. So given that, pretty broad statement, but I think it's a good exercise in the city looking at what we envisioned a number of years ago Dickinson to be, and then also what our views are today. Obviously, commissions have changed, economy has changed, our direction has changed a little bit from those days. So it's always good. It's kind of a rule of thumb that every 5 years you want to look at your comprehensive plan and make sure that it's reflecting what your community desires. So I guess with that, staff is going to feed in during the presentation, but with that, I think KLJ is ready to move with their presentation.
All right, thank you, Mr. Hadley.
Good morning, everyone. Mayor, I appreciate the fact that it's still the 20th. Summer goes way too fast. We don't need to push it forward by 10 days.
I know.
But we really appreciate the opportunity to come here today. We were contacted a couple months ago regarding to look at the importance of what planning really is. So we have put together some thoughts on not just the plan as it exists, and we worked quite a bit with staff through different opportunities. And so what we've done is created that, as well as some of the things that we've seen over time that we'd like the city to maybe consider. My name is Steve Slutner. I am the market director for commercial, institutional, and real estate development. That means I go, the area that I cover of the country is the eastern and western hemispheres. So what's happened, I've had the privilege of doing private sector development projects in about 24 different states. So we get to see, at the risk of sounding like a farmer's insurance ad, we've seen a lot of things. And what happens is we get to have the privilege of accumulating a lot of that stuff and bringing it into plans. And so that's why I will be doing part of the presentation on looking at that part of your plan. Brett Gerholt is one of our planners out of the Bismarck office. He handles a lot of the comprehensive plan work that we do. And so with that, I'm gonna sit down and let Brett take over, and we're gonna tag team. We're also gonna be interacting with your staff as well as hopefully you. This is not meant to be a procession through a presentation to cumulative questions and answers at the end. We would appreciate that during the process. It makes it a lot more lively and interactive, and we enjoy that much more. So with that, I'll let Brett take over.
Good morning, commissioners. It's great to be here. I'm Brett Gerholt, and just to kind of further introduce myself, I do enjoy planning very much. I'm actually trained as a professional landscape architect. I've been with KLJ for 15 years now, and we've been able to really have a lot of fun working with communities across North Dakota, anywhere from planning to engineering to construction implementation. We've been involved in every phase. And it's very interesting to me how North Dakotans plan. I think we're some of the best planners that there are. Because if you look back in history, when you grow up on farms and when the weather is cold, as much as it is in North Dakota, planning becomes critical. We don't really do anything without a plan. And my wife, a little bit of a personal story, she really, in the beginning of our marriage, really struggled with me because everything I did required a plan, right? It was, let's fix the kitchen cabinets. Well, I need a plan to do that first. And so she became very frustrated. I think I've done a pretty good job of working with her to kind of explain how important planning is in everything that we do, especially when it comes to city planning. And so that's why we're here. We look at this as a really good opportunity to share information with you and hear back from you on how we're doing. Of course, it's been a few years since the comprehensive plan has been done, and so we look at this as a point for us to check in with you, see how things are going, but maybe also reintroduce ourselves to those that are new to the Planning Commission, City Commission, and just kind of hear back from you on information we can take back to the office and think about for another way to come back and provide some solutions as we keep looking at the evolution of the city of Dickinson. So let's go to the next slide, please. Oh, great. I'm not sure I'm qualified to use this, but we'll give it a shot. All right, there we go. So why is planning important? I just talked about some of the general reasons why, but we're actually emphasizing why is city planning important. And we start off with this image of a beautiful city scene, right? Because we talk a lot about city planning, but to us, and I'm having trouble getting the text going here. There we go. Planning and what your jobs is to do is really ensure that planning results in livable communities. What do we mean by livable communities? It's a lot of these things that are difficult to define, but the outcomes, maybe you can help me with this. Oh, there we go. Livable communities then attract people and business. That's the ultimate goal of what we're trying to do with livability. Forecasting and mitigating potential problems, right? When we've got differing land uses, different zoning principles, planning really seeks to look at the potential problems that could occur with conflicting land uses. And then, of course, finally, seeking harmony between land uses to promote the safety and welfare of the public. I was involved in a kind of a mayor's livability summit in Bismarck, and we were tasked with kind of looking at what it meant to be a livable community. And we reached out to our community to kind of determine what those things were. It ranged from everything from climate to the river to our architecture. And so there are a lot of very interesting things when you have to look at livability. Extends far beyond generally what we can do with city planning, but it really stems from city planning. And so, again, what we're really after with city planning is just this idea and notion of creating livable communities. Some of the emerging city planning issues on the screen, we've got 3 different things that we really are focused on when we talk about city planning. Right in the middle is kind of the sweet spot, and what we're calling sustainable development. That's what we all seek to find, kind of that balance between the 3 circles. And those 3 circles are a sense of community, the economic prosperity of the community, and finally environmental stewardship. Some of the emerging issues then, of course, as you've seen in the past few years in your community, rapid urbanization. I think that's something that we're seeing in not only Dickinson, but North Dakota in general, where we're losing population in some of our smaller communities, and people are urbanizing. So what can we do as planners and city leaders to be aware of the pressures that we're seeing on our cities and our infrastructure? We have seen, and we've seen this nationwide, this is not a North Dakota issue, but generally poor quality infrastructure or lack of infrastructure to support growth. That's one of those topics we're going to talk about when we look at your comprehensive plan and some of the comments we received years ago back in that, and actually what you've done to bolster that up and support that to support your growth. I talked a little bit about land use conflicts, and that really is adjusted and mitigated through effective planning. Environmental impacts, as planners and city leaders, we talk about the concept of environmental being a pretty broad-based term. What does that exactly mean, environmental? But we're seeing a lot of our open spaces, a lot of our areas used for stormwater management, areas that used to cleanse stormwater and provide an environmental benefit being kind of swallowed up by development. So when you, and as city leaders, look at development proposals that are over areas that you've seen in the history of the city of Dickinson as being, wetlands or low areas, what can you do as leaders to effectively help to steer development in a way that preserves those items? Affordable housing has been a significant one in Dickinson, especially. So again, what does the role of planning do to help you to provide affordable housing through some of your development proposals? Again, one of the top emerging planning issues that we're facing is multimodal transportation. I'm not sure any of us could forecast the day in which we were talking about self-driven cars, right? And that day is not too far off on the horizon. We've seen a lot of emphasis throughout the generations on transportation. A lot of our cities and subdivisions were built to support automobile traffic, and that's certainly a necessity of a lot of city development. But what happens long-term as new generations put more emphasis on walkability and bikeability through our cities, and this idea of public transportation and automated vehicles is going to change the paradigm of city planning quite significantly, like it did in the 60s.
Brett, the multimodal transportation, the model, and I understand where we're going, but in a place like western North Dakota, where the car is still important to most of us, do we lag behind the national trend? The Minneapolises, the Denvers, they're going to develop first.
Yep.
And I mean, we're going to have a certain amount of population before that's even viable for us to kind of figure into the plan.
Absolutely. And we lag because we have to.
Right.
I mean, there's certain environmental conditions, like when it's 40 below in February, there's not a lot of people wanting to ride bikes to work. But
Right.
it's one of these chicken or the egg principles. Do we provide the infrastructure first? Is it lagging because the infrastructure is not there, or is it lagging because of the environmental conditions? Steve, you might want to.
As somebody who lives in Denver and used to live in Minneapolis, your two examples, even larger cities struggle with how to handle it. Minneapolis, for example, is now trying to retrofit their urban area to have light rail. Denver built it well in advance with the build it and they shall come type of scenario. The problem with Denver is if you don't live on it, it doesn't necessarily meet your needs. So even big cities are struggling with that. There's no solution that they've found yet to do it. So it's certainly something to keep at the front of your thought process, rather than Minneapolis as an example trying to retrofit. It's slightly expensive to tear down neighborhoods to fit a light rail in. You also end up with just a tad bit of opposition when you decide to do those things, and so it's good to keep it, no matter who you are, in your thought process.
Thank you.
I would also add to that, Mayor, that I do a lot of work for parks and recreation districts, and I can tell you from even local government all the way up to state government, there's a strong emphasis on providing alternative transportation trails along with roadway construction projects, as has been done in Dickinson. So we're getting there. I just don't know, none of us have a crystal ball to see what the future generations are going to kind of require in their cities and in their environments. So lastly on the list is the funding for public projects. We've seen a big shift in that too. We're actually forecasting that we're entering a period in which funding for public projects might come in the form of private partnerships. And that's something that we're just on the cusp of seeing. It's being done in other communities, but I think cities are trying to leverage, of course, what the private investment can be in some of these public projects as well. One major topic that's emerging is gentrification, especially through neighborhood design. And what I would say is that we've observed that not to be something that's been purposefully done, but it happens on accident, where we plan new neighborhoods and the houses that go in are a certain income level, and then the school that's built is there to support that housing subdivision. And it precludes kind of this mix of income levels and social fabric, again, keying kind of back to that sense of community, where we can be involved in a school where not everybody is just like us. We come from a varied background, and I think it helps to build our children's sense of community and kind of that diversity that makes our community special. Lastly, then, creating neighborhoods, not subdivisions. We've said that a lot. It doesn't take a lot of creativity to subdivide a piece of property, right? I mean, it's as easy as taking a big square and adding a couple of lines and creating 4 squares, but creating neighborhoods is something that's a little bit more abstract. It's a little more difficult to achieve because you have to involve things like schools and walkability and parks and things that, have kind of slipped off the radar in a lot of communities across our state and region. So again, the ultimate goal there is really creating neighborhoods and not subdivisions.
Brett, if you could hold on this slide for just a second. To the city commissioners who were here last night, I think the diagram is really interesting because we really touched on all 3 of these last night. I looked at this slide last week with Brett and Steve, and it didn't pop in my head until right now. But when we had Mr. Radden here last night, we really talked about all 3 of these things, this sense of community. We need these types of businesses in Dickinson, or at least that was their presentation. Economic prosperity, and like Brett touched on, funding for public projects. We talked about that last night. And then environmental stewardship. We have to build these projects the right way so we don't have some of the issues like we had on Dickinson Hills. So just a good example of those 3 things, and when you do them all right, you hit that sweet spot in the middle. So.
Exactly. Thank you, Craig, for adding that. So we took a snapshot of a community survey when we began the comprehensive plan, and the top arrows indicate kind of the highest score or the ones needing the most attention. And so I'll just kind of go through those from left to right, but on the very left at the highest kind of category was the availability of homes to purchase. Next is the cost of purchasing a home. Next was the availability of rental housing. Next was the cost of housing rent. Then if you move over a little bit to kind of the right third of the graph, infrastructure improvements, that's roads, sewer, and drainage. And then finally, lastly, the truck traffic in the city. Now keep in mind, these were issues back in 2012, and in talking with your staff a little bit further, the encouraging thing is that you went ahead and solved these issues. You knew about them and you did something about it. And so the question we have at this time is, what now are kind of the issues in the city's mind? What would this same survey play out the same way now if you were to ask the residents? And maybe, we want to pause at this one just for a second and get your thoughts on what you see as kind of the top issues that you'll see in the next couple of years here in Dickinson.
I think some of the housing concerns are still there. I don't think they would rank as high as before, because I think there is availability. And Shirley and Jason, you guys could talk to that. I think there's availability of housing in apartments. Rent's something we can't control. That's basically a product of the market that we're in out here. Oil comes back, and I know there's notifications going out right now that rent's going back up. And that's just because oil's ramping back up. And But I do see one thing on there that's going to be a glaring issue, and I know it's hard for us as a city commission and as planning and zoning, but it's something that we have to take into account, and that is the quality of K through 12 education. And we are on the edge of needing a lot of new infrastructure, especially the public schools. They're talking 2 to 3 possibly elementary schools, 2 at least for sure. And they're seriously going to need to look at the high school and what they're going to do with the high school, if they're going to retrofit it, if they're going to add to it. I know the discussion at one point was to build a whole new facility, and then that was kind of taken out of the equation because of the costs that were presented to people locally. I would say now that's one of our glaring needs that we're going to have to address, and it's not only we have to address it as a city, but the state has to address it. We're not the only city that the population of the kids that are coming up is just enormous. We're having 700 live births a year out here. We graduated. Jason, if you want to hand me my folders laying down there, at Perkins Street. I just got the printouts from Stark County. I think we graduated just over 200 seniors this year from the public high school, and our kindergarten class is 350.
Yeah.
And they're going to get, they're just going to continue to get larger.
Right.
Especially with 700 live births a year. And Reed Raymond from the hospital says they take in the equation and they find out what of those are local births, and it's about 80%. So you're looking at class sizes of about 560, 550 to 560 if we retain those individuals. Now you think about that, and Commissioner Trustum was a teacher, and she can tell you her classrooms were maxed out. And if we go from 220 to 500 in a class, we need to start addressing this now. Not only as the school district, but also as a city and a planning and zoning, where we're gonna fit these new schools into, and create those, what you had on your slide, create those neighborhoods. And we're not just sticking what happened with the middle school, sticking out at the edge of town. Which I don't know what the walkability score out there is, but I wouldn't say it's probably very high.
Well,
anyone else? So
I would say, one of the biggest changes from 2012 is in 2012, we were really an aging community. We had a high population of elderly, and we were bleeding our youth out prior to that, and we were looking at how do we sustain the schools that we currently had at that point, and how do we get away from consolidation, and what were we going to do. Now we've flipped that to absolutely the opposite, that we have a much younger population, and when you have a younger population, then things like trails and quality of life and revitalizing your downtown so that it is a community center. We've created different problems than we've had before, and they're good problems to have because we have the economy to back them up, and we've got a much brighter outlook, I think, than our city has ever had. So a lot has happened in 6 years. In 6 years, things have happened in this community that take 2 generations in other communities to have happen. And so those are the things that we really have to start addressing now.
Yeah, one of the items up there was the availability of cultural facilities, and that's pretty low at that time. And I would almost think that that's going to change. That we have to build these facilities that allow us to bring things to Dickinson, because that's what's going to events and be it sporting events, concerts, whatever, or even just outdoor activities, is what our attraction is going to be beside the jobs here in Dickinson. And retaining people, because we don't have, as you said, you lived out in Denver. We don't have the spectacular mountain range that runs adjacent to Dickinson that's going to attract hundreds of thousands of people because they want to be in the mountains. We're attracting people because of jobs, and that's the reality of our world. We have high-paying jobs here. We're attracting people because of that. Now we have to give them the quality of life features that they want to bring their families and stay here. And I think we've done that to a degree. Just you can look at the live births. We're retaining a lot of younger families. And you look at the families around Dickinson, they all seem to have 3 to 5 kids in tow, these young families. So I think we've done a lot of great things, but we have a lot of things that we still need to accomplish. So,
Mr. President.
yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay. I think another important thing to note is our focus going to be on encouraging infill, or are we going to continue to have that mentality of build it and they will come, continue to increase public infrastructure, which that was the topic of conversation last night. So I think we need to decide where we are at with that and how we want to proceed in the future. I think that's really important.
Well, I think we kind of in planning and zoning, Mr. Jackson, you requested the empty lots or the vacant lots. And we found out we have a lot of existing lots within the city limits. Was it 670? From that?
674,
674?
That's strictly residential.
right.
Yeah, I think there was residential. Isn't that what you requested, Mr. Jackson?
Yeah, I don't remember the exact number, but yeah, the purpose of the exercise was to evaluate where we stand with infill, and it's so darn important in this community. But it's difficult to do. How do you make an owner of 100 acres develop his property and make it happen? We
I
can
wanna add-
encourage, there are things, but we can't.
The most important thing right now I'm hearing, and we're selling homes because of the larger families and the younger families, 3 bedrooms on 1 level. So if we're talking about housing in the builders, whether you're building a split or a ranch style home, those are requesting 3 bedrooms on 1 level. The other thing is busing. I think we really need to look at busing because of the kids can't drive to middle school, so the parents have to haul them, and that prevents one of the parents from working or having to work around those schedules to take their children and pick them up. So in-town busing, I think, like we used to have, I think is something we really need to look at. And there are only so many homes, and Jason, you know that. You build a school, yes, and then everybody buys those houses up in that area, but what happens when they're all sold? Which we're finding at Prairie Rose. So you gotta look at that too.
And we'll hit on some of those things as we go through our presentation on infill and how do you maybe look at some of your things differently. I wanted to just speak on funding, for schools. For example, is critical, and funding is getting harder and harder to find. So our company is looking at alternative ways to capture funding outside the traditional bond referendum scenarios. What are different opportunities for cities to be successful in those arenas? Because it's a really big deal. It's hard to get those. It's hard to justify them. It's hard to get people to buy into that referendum. So what are the other opportunities we have? And so we're actively right now looking at that. But I think it's not unique to here. Everybody is having a look at how do we get that school or that addition or the new roof put on or upgraded to ADA, whatever those requirements are. The funding has become a very critical piece, and I think that's something as we talk about that is the real issue for cities as well.
And just to summarize this slide, it sounds like there's more work to be done to kind of update this and maybe re-solicit some of this information back to the community. But I really want to commend you as city leaders and your staff that you've really addressed a lot of what were the primary issues back in 2012 when this was asked. A lot of these what was current issues aren't really current issues right now. They've changed. So probably need to go back and, as with most comprehensive plans, or all of them should go back and ask the question, where are we at now and how are we doing? It's kind of a continuum, so. All right. Important considerations in reviewing development proposals. A lot of these items are really staff-related items. That's what you have excellent staff for. They look at all of these things when they're reviewing development proposals, but we just thought we'd kind of just go through them just as a cursory overview, just to kind of talk about what we all should be looking for when we look at development proposals. So number one is the project purpose and need. And that's not only from the developer's standpoint, but the city's standpoint. Does the project fulfill a purpose, beyond what the development proposal calls for the city's side of things? We talked a lot about the environmental considerations, that there's going to be a lot of pressure on that as cities expand and grow. We've talked about utilities and infrastructure. One of the key things that I heard in Governor Burgum's address at our Livability Summit was the tax on utilities and infrastructure. We talked about schools. Where they decide to put new schools, we have to extend water and sewer to those locations. And then what do? We make trips for people longer. They have to take the bus. They can't walk. So that is a key discussion right now, is how we're spending our tax dollars on extending those city services. Setbacks and buffers, a lot of those things are already set up in your code. Those are established to protect landowners and businesses from incompatible uses, and what happens when we have land uses like high density residential adjacent to commercial. Those buffering, the things we can do in the landscape to help ease some of those concerns is important. Open space and parks, it's great to see the advent of bringing back neighborhood parks to a lot of our communities. For a while it became a real issue for cities to maintain small parks. They were trending towards larger community parks so that they could have more maintenance facilities in one location. But then developers came back and said, wow, parks are really integral to our ability to market and to sell not only subdivisions but neighborhoods. So as you're reviewing proposals, the question should be asked, how are we tying this in with our trail system? How are we tying it into our parks? How are we making these neighborhoods and not subdivisions? Buildings and materials. The interesting thing to note about this, when you look at like downtown Dickinson as compared to what might be on the fringe, our downtowns were designed for walking, right? They were designed for even horses and buggies where the speed limit was 5 miles an hour. So the detail in the brick and the facades was something so much more tangible. And as the automobile industry has obviously advanced and contributed to our planning, we're now designing communities for 50 mile an hour. So the detail is less, and so that's appropriate. It just depends on what context you're doing that in. But that is an important one as far as the livability and kind of your retention of your residents, to look at buildings and materials, especially as it relates to differing land uses together. Construction, that's more of your building permit side, but something to be aware of in development proposals, just what are the construction techniques and methods. A lot of us have seen contractors come in from different areas due to the oil boom, and they're not quite as well versed in how we build things in North Dakota for sustainability. So just being aware of those methods can be different from proposal to proposal. And then finally, efficient design, which is really what Steve's expertise is and what he's going to talk with you about more later on in the presentation, and how that can how we can tee that up for successful city growth. A little bit about zoning principles. I know most of you are familiar with this, but on the left is a copy of your future land use plan. And it was interesting to me to learn kind of the history of zoning principles. It's relatively new in the history of planning. About the 1920s, 1930s, they developed a system and a structure for kind of color-based zoning, which is really, the outcome of this really in practice is to prevent new development from harming existing residents or businesses. And harming is kind of a global term, but again, this is really meant to make sure that you have a good harmony of land uses adjacent to each other, and that you're not faced with a situation where there's going to be some angst and some conflict there. So the zoning codes are really set up for success. There's a lot of thought put into those, and I think your future land use plan speaks to those factors. It was mentioned earlier about downtown. I think if you resurveyed your community, you would find a stronger prominence on what the role of downtown is. It certainly is in Bismarck. This is a snapshot of our downtown plan. And really, we're re-looking at how critical our downtown areas have been to the success of our communities, not only because it's our greatest example of architecture and mixed use, but really the tax base that exists in downtowns. When you look at a chart of how much tax base is contributing to your general fund, it spikes where your downtowns are because of the density. And so as you lose density, you move out into the fringe, your tax base starts to diminish. So we're really starting to take a stronger investigation and a re-look at how we can start to infill, taking advantage of that existing infrastructure, and provide a street front to some of these areas that are currently underutilized. A great example of that in Bismarck would be what we've done, or what they've done with their parking ordinance. Years ago, they went in and said that we are not going to require new development to install parking lots to the extent that they would in other commercial districts. We actually have what's called a core district, in which if a new developer comes in or a new building comes in, they do not have to provide off-street parking. And that is a huge savings. That's a huge incentive to them to develop downtown space, because there's a lot of cost in providing surface parking lots. Now, most people would counter that by saying, well, then aren't you creating a parking problem, right? You're creating a situation where there's no parking. And most of the downtown experts that we've talked to say, that's great. We'll take the communities with a parking problem. It turns over, there's activity, and that's what those investors want to see when they go into a downtown. I see some smiles and nods. I don't know if you guys have a comment there. Or?
Please elaborate.
Yeah.
We are building or have approved a theater across the street here, which is, if you have noticed, was a parking lot.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great.
And all we hear is, what are you going to do about parking?
Yeah. And I will tell you that we hear that a lot too. It's kind of it's an exercise in patience, and time will kind of tell. A lot of those mindsets change over time. It's not easy right away. I understand, and we've dealt with that too. We have parking structures that we thought were utilized, but we figured out that were underutilized. They're now offering those for free at after 5 p.m.
And we a number of us went to the Main Street initiative in Bismarck, and the presenters there, they did emphasize over and over, it's a mindset.
Right.
It's getting past the, I can't see the front door, I'm not going to park there.
Right.
Right. So it is something we have to work. It's a challenge, but we'll work through it, and it's going to be a great addition to our downtown.
I agree. Last is walkability, and that's a really difficult one in North Dakota as well. We as planners look at walkability being a 5-minute walk. That's about 1,500 feet. That's about really all you can expect somebody to walk from, so when you start looking at your downtown, draw a 1,500-foot circle, and that's really the availability of parking that you have. We're working with downtown Devil's Lake right now, and we've assessed the inventory of their parking downtown, and they're like, wow, we never realized we had that much available. And that does come along with some business owners that are concerned that they're going to lose 6 or 7 stalls with some streetscape updates there. But it's a balancing act, and it's changing mindsets. It's getting people to take 5 minutes to walk instead of parking right next to the building. I certainly could use it as far as my my health goes. So I just want to touch a little bit further on, maybe a little bit deeper dive on the importance of growing from the core. We've talked about these in a roundabout way, but we're reducing transportation or the need to drive. We've got better access to services, and services that are included in like a mixed use environment. So downtowns offer some interesting things. You know, there's dental care, there's chiropractic care, there's banks. There's a lot of different mixed uses, and you can walk to many of them without having to drive. When you get density, you get affordable housing as an outcome of that. I know that's a general term, and it's one that I can't even define for you, what is affordable, but it certainly lends itself better to affordable housing in terms of rent and things when you're infilling property and utilizing underutilized property in downtowns. Again, less demands on infrastructure and city funds. Again, if we're developing our infill and we're developing our downtown core, we're offsetting that by preserving our open space and our agricultural land. I think that's one thing that has not been at the center of the debate, is what are we going to do in 50 to 100 years when our agricultural land no longer produces the food that we need to survive. And so at some point we have to balance all this with the open space and agricultural land as well. And we talked about parking incentives, and in the example of Bismarck, now they are looking at their surface parking lots, and this would be an example on the screen of what would the street face look like with infill, where we start to encourage parking lots behind and bring that building and that street front closer to the street, and promote kind of a ground floor retail with maybe a second story living or second and third story living units with ground floor retail. So again, huge emphasis. North Dakota seems to be on board with the role of downtown, but as you said, Mayor, it's a mindset and something we're kind of transitioning through as we work through it. Any questions on that?
Going vertical, and it started to, some of these businesses started remodeling their apartments up above and so on, and that brought in a few more people downtown and everything. Well, and then the boom went bust, and now we're like this here. I see that it's probably going to spike up again when we get a little more infill downtown. One of the parking situations is that someday I think we're going to have to look at a parking structure, and those aren't cheap. I think you guys found that out.
Mm-hmm.
So those are some challenges that we're going to have.
Just for the public, on parking structures, general parking structure, what does it run a spot?
Oh, I believe maybe Steve, if you know better, but I think $15,000 a stall is what I've heard as a planning.
Well, I've heard higher than that. But
Have you?
yeah, I've heard around 30.
Okay.
It's kind of that depends thing. You know, the how much land you have. You know, how tight is it going to be? A lot of ramp space and very little parking on each level, or do you have a lot of room to put the ramps in and then have many spots on each level? Those are the things that really vary that number. You know, and things change, you know, with time. You hear different numbers based on your environment. I mean, you guys have a very harsh environment here compared to, you know, somewhere in Texas. You know, so the numbers change and all those things. But
I think a big variable in that, and we have talked about this prior, on the parking ramps is, what do you want it to look like? You want it to look like a parking ramp from a block and a half away, or do you want it to look like a beautiful, nice structure that's not a parking ramp? And that's where your cost could be, from the $15,000 to the $45,000.
I grew up in Wisconsin, in Eau Claire, a city, that's not all that large, and they put a parking ramp in downtown. It was, back in the 70s, it was a really big deal. The problem was is it was a small community that didn't necessarily understand parking ramps, and the first thing that happened was a dually pickup truck got stuck in the ramp because they didn't anticipate the size of vehicles, the designers, and so you have those issues here. It's interesting how those things, and then suddenly it became the plague that everybody laughed at. So you want to make sure you do things right from the start.
Yeah. We may have a farm truck pulling a 30-foot livestock trailer get stuck in that parking ramp someday.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that 6'6" bar, plastic bar that hit the top was just a good start.
Hold the letters, please, to the editor.
I wanted to just to add a bit on to what Brett was saying. This is a wonderful opportunity. Again, you're 6 years out on a plan. It's a good time to go back and look at a check because things have really changed and appear to look like they're going to change again. The same things you're talking about. Again, I live in downtown Denver. They look at surface parking as an actual, like a brownfield, like a contaminated site that they need to eliminate somehow. They're going to things that they would have never have thought of. But the intermodal part of it is so many people are riding bikes to work and things that are progressing differently. We just finished a project down in Fredericksburg, Texas, where your diagonal parking that you have here, they found that it was starting to fill up so much that it became an issue. So what they did is they changed the angle of their parking to back in rather than pull in, because it's safer when you have big vehicles on both sides of you to back in because you can control what's behind you. So it's just little things like that that change some of the scenarios and how you look at things. That got them much better density. Their accidents went down by simply changing that to a back-end diagonal, which gets you a lot more space on the street, obviously, than parallel parking. But sometimes it's just the little things.
But there was an education process there, getting people to back in.
Yes, yes. The first time it happened, you had to, what we did is it was lined up with landscape islands at the beginning, so you couldn't just divert into it, that you physically had to do that. So the first step was putting those islands in. And then there was a bit of a folly for a while. I think they had some citizens there invest in trying to assist people because it was confusing at first. So, but it helped. Those are things you have to solve as you go along the way. One of the things that was brought up when we first started meeting, and my first meetings were with Sean, and he is the one that I was introduced to start this topic and conversation. But one of the issues that came up was with the ETZ, where you have the ability to, an authority to look at zoning, but not permitting. And what that does to your growth patterns. We were just talking a lot about infill and opportunities that exist. And I understand the need for property rights, but I also understand the need for orderly growth of the city, and how do you balance those? That's always the big question. But what happens in situations like this is that it becomes very expensive to serve. And you'll have one or two businesses that decide that they want some of the service. Maybe they want water, or maybe they want sewer, but they don't need both. And so suddenly you're getting requests in some of these ETZ areas that are very expensive to serve. And yet, there's opportunities there, but a lot of the folks that are there probably aren't going to have a heavy water use, or they're not going to have a heavy need for sewers. So what it does is it really stretches your infrastructure. It stretches the cost. And these areas are always areas that we look at is very, very difficult to justify from an expenditure standpoint, which what happens is sometimes they get zoned and they get allowed without a real look at the future. And that's one of the things that we just wanted to identify with some of that, the planning and how you want to be more precise in looking at it from a holistic standpoint. So far, I've hit it once and it worked. It was just you. Either that or it worked, or woke up, I should say. I wanted to just briefly go through some of the chapters. I know the staff made a presentation in July of 2016 looking at a lot of the different chapters of your plan, but I wanted to focus on just what went into the plan from my perception is there's a reason. I don't know those reasons, why you picked these chapters, why you thought that these were important. There are core chapters that are there in every plan, but there are others that surface, and then which one are the priorities for the city of Dickinson, went through a process and set up these are the issues that it did. It looked at your existing conditions, you went through your surveys, it defined what those chapters were, it forecasted your future requirements. But the biggest thing is you try to set up some predictability in a budget. Those are really big things, along with shaping and formatting what your city looked like. And the last one sounds like a bit of a inverse word use, but proactively react. That's one of the things that I think we too often are just reacting. You can't anticipate everything. You don't know the next landowner that's going to come in and ask for a zoning change or an amendment, or who's going to bring their plan in next. Or as you talked about this morning at the planning meeting, you know, with regard to the new ordinance you're looking at, the special uses, you don't know where they're going to be. You don't know how that's going to look. So that's where I like to use the words proactively react to the different opportunities. This was, as I read your plan, I was very impressed by this section, and I just wanted to bring it up. This is the discussion that we've already had with regard to downtown parking and other issues, and somebody with a stock trailer and those types of things, and identifying and knowing who you are and the impacts of that, and also what is around you. I really enjoyed the lessons learned section. I thought that was something that really set the stage for your comprehensive plan, to look at where you sit in the world and where you are in importance of this community to what the resources are here. I loved the part about the 3 phases of energy development. To me, that was a really big deal to identify, because it's what affects your plan. Too often people don't look at those things. They look at the rosy things of what the plan would like to be, and don't look enough at who we really are. So I just wanted to bring this up. And what it did is, the last part is that I thought was the most important, was quickly take actions to moderate or suspend investments. That one was a really big deal. That in itself, to me, I really applaud the city and the commissions and everybody that had input in that, because I think that's so important. Just want to go through this really quick. I wanted to highlight land use. We've already talked about that this morning a bit. But effectively managing the location, timing, and fiscal impacts of future development. Commissioner Jackson, you talked about the inventory that's in the city, and Walter and his staff shared that with me. You've got a lot of opportunities within the city already, and how do you promote that? It's hard to do, but is there ways that you can influence it? And so I think you've done a good job of looking at what you have and identifying what it can have, and also the fiscal impacts, which will be in the next area. Promote and require high quality. Those are things that typically people think that goes with a high dollar amount, and what that really doesn't have to happen. And so I've heard that discussion today, and I think those are things you need to continue to look forward to. Brett mentioned the words affordable housing. I remember sitting in Woodbury, Minnesota at a planning commission meeting, and they were talking about affordable housing, and in that same breath they were using the number $550,000. and they felt that that was affordable housing. And so I think sometimes we need to identify what really is affordable, because that shocked a lot of people, to say the least. From an infrastructure, the third one is a really one that I think is where cities can impact. The planning things that you do point to improvements that are going to be required, and they go to what it's going to cost, ultimately what it's going to cost. Everything you do has a price tag with it, and it has an importance to the community. And so what you have to do is weigh all those in your plan to what the costs are going to be. And so that, the infrastructure piece, feeds into all that. But this is a chapter that I don't see in very many plans, the actual implementation. So this was really unique for me to read that. To actually use the plan. Number one, the first word there, use. This is a document that I've heard a lot of people refer to and a lot of people talk to, even if you haven't used the word comprehensive plan in some of the discussions. It is in the back of your mind. And so I think that's something that the city has done really well, and it's probably, as things change in the city, things move forward in the city, it's something to revisit and make sure you're still on the right track, or if things change, as Brett discussed in the survey that was done. But to establish that 5-year CIP is a really big deal. And then the last one I thought was something that I'd not seen before, and so those are really refreshing things that make me feel like Dickinson is well ahead of a lot of other folks. Chapter 12 is what was interesting to me is you broke your plan down into 3 different segments. Obviously, some of those segments are gone. It's probably time to relook at the big long-term phase 3. We are now in the start of phase 3, and so as you look at things and go through that, but to develop those scenarios, to create that vision, that's really what the plan is about, which then defines the program, which results in a budget. That's the process, to me, of what comprehensive planning does for a community. The next thing that I wanted to talk about is what we decided was an important topic. This one is I'm very passionate about. I work with private developers almost exclusively, and what I've found is what private developers want and what cities want is typically the same thing, but they don't articulate it very well. And so how can we work together? How can people work together? And so at KLJ, we're looking at a program to try to integrate those two things. And one of the things I'd like to talk about is your code, in expecting more out of your code. So if you would bear with me, what I'd like to talk about is efficiency of design. You as a community have been exposed to, in the past, a land planner out of Minneapolis. I've worked with quite a bit, Rick Harrison Site Design. I don't know if that name rings a bell or if everybody has seen that work, and it's a very creative way of trying to minimize infrastructure costs and still create an opportunity for success. It's one method of doing things. What I'd like to talk about today is taking those same types of principles, but just looking at them without some of the other things that go with it, and how we can be better and expect more. By doing that, that's what happens is the back falls off. Is if we can be efficient in our design, the developer would have less infrastructure costs, which has less risk because they have less carrying cost. For the city, here's something that the developers never talk about in front of a community, but if their design is efficient, you can lower your life cycle maintenance cost per home, which stretches your tax dollars, which lowers the amount potentially of assessments if you're a city that does assessments and for future expectations. But ultimately, it'll stabilize your lot prices. We talked a lot about affordability and the dollars for housing is, the changes happen where you have more inventory, but the price is still high. So how can we do that with our design? And for the last thing, for the residents, it stabilizes lot prices and therefore stabilizes home prices. What I like to talk about, the term that you'll hear us be using a lot is return on your investment. Lots of times we talk about that with our land developers, talk about it as a revenue versus expense. It's a pretty simple thing. When you get down to it, how much money am I going to make? But for a city, it's a tax base versus life cycle maintenance cost. It's your revenue is tax based, and your expenses are what it's going to cost to maintain all that, and what is the return on that investment. Now, for a city, there's also cultural return on investments and other intrinsic things that can be there as well. But from a pure investment standpoint, it's that. So many times, I'm sitting in commission meetings in different communities and council meetings, and what happens is a staff report, and please don't take this wrong, Walter, but what happens is the staff report says it meets our ordinance. And it'll typically say that. And then there'll be some conditions or something else, but it always says it meets our ordinance. It never says it exceeds our ordinance. It never says that, wow. What it says is it meets the minimum standards. So what we're creating is a city of minimums. And that's the part that I just like to go through a few slides to get you thinking about creating a city that's different than just a city of minimums. And so this is just a, I can fly over any city in the nation, and if you want, I've got a few here in Dickinson we can go at the end. And look at a subdivision. And what you'll see is, does this thing have a laser pointer on it? Maybe. No, guess not. The street on the left is probably a collector arterial street. But I'm always going to look within the subdivision. And you might look at that and you say, oh, that looks pretty good. You've got a wetland down on the south side, so you don't want to have houses in that. But other than that, it looks like it's a nice subdivision. But let's look at this. If you are in a subdivision and you're building street that doesn't have driveways on it, you have to ask why. Because what happens is if I look at that closer, and let's say I don't build that street, and instead I move that house, and I create a lot where the other end of the street is, what happened from a developer standpoint, I have 300 feet less street. Now back in 2013, 2014, a foot of street in this city was going for about $1,200 a foot. That includes water, sewer, pavement, that type of thing. That's really high compared to a lot of other cities in the world. We see it down as low as $350 a foot in Tennessee in some areas. But so let's just use 1,000. That's $300,000 that they didn't have to spend. And they got one more lot. But what's that mean to the community? Nobody ever talks about that. That is one more lot of tax base with 300 feet less street of life cycle maintenance cost. And I think that's a really big deal. And what it looks like when you're done is it looks the same. It functions the same. And so what we're doing is the first one met the ordinance, but we're not spending enough time, I believe, on the front end of expecting more. What we do as an industry is we spend not much time on planning, but we spend a lot of time on engineering. And so we submit our engineering plans as a developer's engineer, if we're that person. We submit it to Craig and his staff. They thoroughly go through that and make sure that it meets everything they're looking for, and they'll redline those plans, and we'll go back and forth 2 or 3 times until we get it right. But on the planning side, we simply say it meets our ordinance. And so those are the things that I think we've got things a little out of tune I'm not, by the way, saying that we shouldn't go through the iteration on the engineering side. I'm saying we should look at more iterations on the other side. Let's look at Rapid City. And again, I can pick on any city in the nation. These are the things that I look at. What happens is when you're looking at this, there's a little street.
Craig, I think there's a laser on there, isn't there?
I just, oops, I also went backwards, my fat little finger. Let's look at this street right here. So what happens is engineers feel the need to fill space. Because if we fill space, we get more lots, right? So what if we didn't build that? That's 350 feet less street, but one less lot. I lost a lot. But the street cost, if I'm here in Dickinson, that street cost is about $350,000. I can guarantee you that lot was not worth $350,000. So what I did is I created a scenario where the city benefits, the developer benefits, and hopefully that can be reflected then through the pricing of the community. These streets, single-sided streets. When you build a single-sided street, that means half of the cost of that street has to be allocated to the rest of the lots in that subdivision. It's really not efficient. So what happens, and so then somebody will say, well, you know, what would you do differently? The answer is it's hard to fix it once you see it. It's that spending more time on the planning front and on the planning horizon and having staff be interactive into that process, so we demand more as communities, as well as the developer should be demanding more of their planning staff that they work with. But what that does, in this case, the streets are a lot less down in Rapid City, but it equated to $3,000 a lot that went to every lot in that subdivision that didn't have to happen. Those are the things that when I talk about efficiency and design and looking at that. Filling space, this is something I will talk about a couple times. It provides more lots, right? It's in the developer's best interest, right? And is in, therefore, the city's best interest because you're the ones approving it. And the answer is what is that value to the city? So I look at things like this. Now, these are the things that keep me up at night. Sorry, but I'm a kind of an odd duck that way. I've been trying to push this to communities all across the nation. But if you look at that, what if we have two entrances onto that road there? What if, instead of doing that, I would have done this? Now, that wouldn't be public green space in those backyards. Don't worry about that as from a parks perspective of having to maintain that. I would extend the lot lines. What I wanted to show is where'd the road right-of-way go to? Because what happens is when you don't build road, you get more space. And so what that means in this case is I got the same number of lots, and I had $200,000 in Rapid City of less cost. So again, same tax base, less life cycle maintenance costs. These are, to me, are really big items. And I look at that all over the nation. This is an example I went through with a developer in Omaha, Nebraska. They had 19 subdivisions listed on their development map. So I went out on Google Maps and I flew over each one of them. And I took those developers through an exercise. And the same exercise applies to you folks here. So what we looked at, in a subdivision, if you're building street and there's no driveways on it, why build it? So streets in red are streets built without a home fronting onto them. Or if there is a home fronting onto it, it had an alternate street it could have been put on. Streets in orange have houses on just one side. And then I'd like to talk about the spirit of flow. If you look at these entrances, I come off of this main road, I come in and I have to tee and make a decision. I come in from here and I have to tee, and then I come here and I make this silly jog, and there's no flow through the neighborhood. Those are the things that cost money. They create corner lots. Corner lots are typically the last ones to sell and the most expensive to build. So how can we create scenarios that are different? Those are the things that I look at. So we went through this exercise, and you can imagine us going through 19 of these. And so we looked at all the orange in some of them, and streets that come in and then just dead end. And then we got to this one. There's 4 partners in the room. And all of a sudden, one of the 4 partners, and they're starting to get it. They're up at the screen and they're pointing at different opportunities to save. And one of the partners looked at this and said, I think I'm going to throw up. Because when you looked at the amount of street that was built for nothing, and the amount of street that got allocated to somewhere else, and a roundabout in the middle of a subdivision where that's really not where they belong, and the expense that went with that. Now, I'm not talking about building just the cheapest, ugliest streets and trying to just define a grid by any means, but there's a lot of room in between is my point. You can go with a grid environment as long as it's really efficient and it will serve your citizens well. So what I'd like to do is to get you thinking about efficient design as far as more of an all-encompassing approach. Looking at it from, first of all, for project savings for the developer and yourselves, but also for recession proofing. Because what happens is with all the inventory that's out there right now, that's been out there for quite a while, you know, the good news is not all of it got built. There's a lot of inventory that got built that you are in the process of maintaining roads on, and there's no tax base along it. So we want to try to make things successful so that we can try to recession-proof as much as possible. We'd like to stretch your tax dollars and look at that life cycle maintenance cost as part of the analysis of the review process. And so that's the message that we wanted to take in, because we really feel it's part of the comprehensive planning program. Not expecting just the minimums that it meets your ordinance. And so that's what we wanted to leave you with today. I've got a lot more slides after this buried in there for conversations and questions and comments if people want to see what it looks like here in Dickinson, or if, you know, where all this craziness came from. But Brett and I would love to, and staff obviously too is an integral part of this development of this, take any questions, comments, have a conversation.
Any questions for the gentleman? Comments?
I'd maybe,
Very helpful. I see a lot of things that we did right last year, achieving challenges, and put it out. Very good idea.
It's just too often we get so focused on the plan. But to me, this efficient design carries that plan through, and really brings it forward. Where this came, where the origin went to your question, in 1997, my light bulb went off. Again, I lived in Eau Claire, Wisconsin at that time. It was probably a city of about 40,000 people. So, you know, somewhere between, you know, it grew up about the same as Bismarck did, and, you know, but not that much different than Dickinson. And we were a very blue-collar town, you know, and so things were done with affordability in mind. It was a very big deal. And so what happened is I was given this wonderful, beautiful site of 70 acres. It had one 1-foot contour and corn stubble, you know, just where everybody wants to live. And so what happened is I owned my own company at that time, and we went through, and I went through a process to say, what should I do? Should I do this? So I did that, and came up with a number of lots, number of streets and everything, and then, like a lot of small business owners, I went home and spent the evening with my family, and then I went back in for second shift, because that's what a lot of small business owners do. And I decided that maybe I needed to try to think a little differently. And so I tried to lose those linear thinking approaches that an engineer has and try to get myself to look at things differently. What I did was this, and again, this is 1997. You might say it looks a lot like some of the coves of whatever here in town. There is no coving. All the houses are at the minimum setback. Would I have done stuff differently? I didn't. At this time, I'd never met Mr. Harrison. This was just my engineer scale going crazy. But what I found was the tail of the tape was very interesting. I found that these are the statistics that went with it. I had 1,700 feet less street that went into 2.5 acres of open space. I got rid of rear yard conflicts. I got rid of corner lots. I created a connection to a school and to a park. I had 4 less lots, but when you ran the numbers compared to 1,700 feet of street, again, in a community, this was a community where there was no spec housing. This was you and I would go buy a lot, and then we would go find a builder. Now, today we would call that custom homes. These were not custom homes. You know, these were modest homes that everybody could afford. But what happened is 2 builders saw this and took it and built that out in 1.5 years in a community where it really was not the expectation. And so that's where I learned some of the stuff that I talked about, and this is what it looks like today. Those backyards now have urban woodlot spacings in them, creating something unique and different. It's not a park that the city has to maintain. As Brett said, you know, rather than having the big community parks, to have small pocket parks within subdivisions are what we're hearing developers say that people want. Well, this was that attempt. Again, that was 21 years ago. I've learned a lot and aged a lot since then. You know, but you also take that and take it to the next level. And so those are the things that's what started me thinking on this process. So, Brett, do you have any other thoughts? Walter?
Gene, you might have had a question.
Yeah, maybe just a little discussion on population projections. You know, we grew by 50% in 2 years. But at the same time, we were being told, and the handout that you gave us replicates the work that was done in the comprehensive plan. We were told that by 2015 we were going to be 38,000 people, which would have been a doubling. I think just using gut, we said, you know, that's a euphoric projection, estimation, and you know, we pulled back from that. We just felt that it wasn't something that we were going to see. But in this oil economy that we're in, you really have to throw the book out with so much of this, and gut doesn't always work. I think it did work for us. I think when we pulled back from some of these population projections. But any comments about that? And the reason I ask it is because just, I think, 2-3 weeks ago, NDSU came out with another population projection for the state. I don't think it was for individual communities. That are some really, really wild numbers. And, you know, some would say it's going to happen, but history shows almost without exception that those projections have been really overdone. Any comment on any of that? And I'd be interested in knowing what the rest of the table thinks too.
Commissioner Jackson, what I would say is that your lessons learned section took that into consideration.
It did.
And also understood who you are. You know, maybe threw a little bit of when pigs fly in there. You know, that'll happen. But one of the things that it did result in was a 5-year cap plan, a CIP, that gives you the ability to go back to the words I use, proactively react. And so you could, rather than having to invest all that and build it and they shall come, and then all of a sudden the projections don't happen, to your point, what it did is gave you the opportunity to identify, if it does happen, here are the things that we would need, but let's sit and wait and watch. And I think that's where this plan excelled, is in that area of being able to create a program that can react proactively as you see things happening. Now, you do have seasonality. I mean, you can't do it overnight. Totally get that. But it gave you the ability to look at that as a what if, not as a given it's going to, but as a what if. And so I see that you guys created that flexibility in the plan to be able to, okay, they say this, but. Brett, was that?
I think the only thing that we struggle, and Gene, I agree, those are hard numbers to forecast, and then it's coupled with retention, right? How many of those people did we retain? And even as a company, when we hired people to help support all the work in the boom, we asked the same question, how many can we retain? And the number actually was kind of surprising. We retained, I would say, in my opinion, very few people that came in to help support the work of the oil boom, and then they went back to their families, they moved away. The question to me becomes, out of those times where you experience rapid growth, you have to kind of look at history, like you said, how many of those people do we actually retain through that process? And as we change our city and as we plan our city, how are we teeing ourselves up to retain more and more of those folks? And the school district example that you brought up this morning was key to that. We're going to face a situation in 15 years where we're going to have to add on to our schools big time. And we're seeing that across the board. We're seeing, even when it comes to planning, are we actually requiring proposals to allow for expansion area in a lot of our high schools and middle schools? If we're not, that's probably not the best plan.
Even if you divide, Mayor, even if you divide your number by 2, it's still to Mr. Jackson's. It's still a large number. It's not. It's probably getting to that 38,000, but instead of by year X, it's over here. And is it, to your point, is it sustainable? Even if I divide by 2, it's still a growth pattern that's significant.
Yeah, you divide by 2 and it's double. I mean, we graduated from the public high school 218 this year. Yeah. And if you divide the live births that are,
right,
say it's 350 to 360, it's still very substantial growth in those.
One of the other things we heard as the comprehensive plan was developed is people wanting more retail possibilities in Dickinson. And I think if you asked that question today, it would be the same. People want more retail. Well, today, compared to when we did this, now we have this national trend of online shopping and big boxes and shopping centers closing. And now we have that added hurdle trying to develop retail. There's a reality there that we have to recognize.
There's a huge aspect to the online shopping, but there's still, in our part of the world, there's still that wanting to go to the store.
For some of us.
For some, yes, for some of us. But
that might be age-related, though, yeah, Scott.
It could be. But, like to Commissioner Trustum's point last night, she brought up, we have existing retail space. So how do we balance that? Mm-hmm. I mean, and to the developer's argument last night is, well, nobody wants to go into their space because they designed it wrong. We're going to design it better, and they'll want to go to ours. But we do have the multiple commercial properties that are open. And I guess what do we do as a community to make them attractive as they sit, you know, to these businesses? You know, and a lot of them it is too, is they count households. They count how many heads are running around a city. I always think that's wrong, because I think we're a feeder, we're a center out here. We draw people from Baker, Montana. We draw people from Glendive. We draw people even from Watford, Hettinger. People come to Dickinson, and so we're basically that hub city out on the prairie. So that's how we have to sell ourselves, to draw that commercial, you know, that retail businesses to come in. But it's a hard sell.
As you were talking this morning about your ordinance with regard to marijuana manufacturing and dispensaries, being from Denver, what's interesting is I was just at an event 2 weeks ago, and they talked about the impact of that on the Denver area, and what the impact was is to your point of saying, well, they didn't design this store right. What that industry is eating up is the Class C industrial and commercial space that nobody else wanted. So, you know, it's really interesting how things change. I'm certainly not advocating it, I'm just seeing what's happening, and that's those things that you can't necessarily anticipate, that you want to be able to flex to. Sometimes when people say that the space doesn't necessarily meet, it wasn't designed properly, I want to steal a line from one of the ESPN shows, you know, come on, man. You know, just be a little creative, you know, because that's what we're really asking to do. That was my part of it from a housing standpoint, but it makes the same sense with regard to anything else that we do. You know, come on, let's think a little bit deeper here. And use our backgrounds. So that's the challenge.
I also disagree with having having man camps. We have plenty of apartment buildings that need to be filled. So I'm glad that we did not, because I was a commissioner at the time, so was Mr. Jackson, we did not approve man camps in Stark County. So for our future commission, please do not. We need to fill our apartments.
You know, to piggyback on that, historically Dickinson had a mix of 80% single-family housing, 20% apartments. And when we did the comprehensive plan and when we were building out, we had a lot of pressure to add more apartments. And to Ed Cortons and the whole staff, we didn't cave in, and it was difficult because we were seeing apartment prices hit New York levels, and there was a lot of pressure from the community to open up that floodgate. I can tell you I've had apartment developers come up to me after the fact and say, you know, we were begging you to let us build another 300 plex or 200 plex, and thank God you didn't, because we are sitting at a low occupancy rate. To Scott's point of the young families and the birth rate, the reason that we were able to sustain as a community is because we stuck to our guns. And if we hadn't forced people into buying homes, we would have bled out a lot more population during the downturn. But when you have someone purchase a home in a community, they tend to try to stay in that community rather than if they were in an apartment, they'll just pack up and move away. And so I think that's why we didn't see such a downturn in our population through the downturn in the bust, is because we stuck to the plan. Now 5 years into the plan, I guess I would have a statement for the future commission too, is it is probably time to sit down with city staff and really review where we were, where we are, and where we need to head in the next 10, 15, and 20 years to fill out this plan.
Hey, Clayton, I think that you and others talking about this is creating institutional memory. And we lose it so quickly. We lose the institutional memory. And I think that's maybe the most important reason to have meetings like this today. You know, how many of us remember that we had a year when rents were $2,200 a month, and we were denying building permits and denying new subdivisions because we didn't have water and sewer facilities to service them. So while rents were way up here and we had all these housing needs, we were forced to curtail development for about a year there. Now, how dramatic is that?
Mhm.
And you know, hopefully we won't have that issue for years to come. I don't believe we will. But we need to remember that.
Being where you're at, and I was in the, at that time, I worked for a different firm that was heavily involved with the developers out here, and watching what was happening and wonder if it was sustainable. And at that time, in the early 2012-13, I lived in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, the home of Menards, and Menards was hiring people from the Eau Claire area and flying them out on their jet to Minot to work at the store because they couldn't find local help and all those things. And yes, that's stressful on an economy, but when it moves, as you have defined in your plan, the 3 different phases of oil field development, as it moves and changes, you're going to still be there. And those are the things that recognize. I keep going back to the slide, but that was the most impressive slide that, or part of the plan that I saw, is knowing and understanding that, making tough decisions in those times when people are clamoring for that. You know, we're a big deal, and it's what helps the community survive, as well as those that are developing and working in it. So.
Any other comments? I guess you have any more slides for us, or?
I could show you a couple examples of.
I think we have some people there. I see a lot of looking at phones here, probably appointments and jobs they need to attend. So
yep.
I guess what I would like to do is invite, if there are commission members from either planning and zoning or the city commission, if they want to hang around afterwards and visit with you, so that we can conclude this meeting, and then we can get some people back to work, and some of us that want to hang around can hang around and have a conversation with you.
And Commissioner Decker, I just want to add, I think that's a great point, that we really need to sit down and review the comprehensive plan with not only the new commission, but with the newest city administrator as they come in. I think that's going to be a very important meeting to have, so that we can all get on the same page. And I think planning and zoning is a crucial part of that as well.
We want to thank staff for recognizing this and allowing us to come before you, and we appreciate your time, and again, we'll stick around. Thank you.
Appreciate your time also. Anything else for the good of the cause? All right, we look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
We're adjourned.